The Holy Post podcast is supported by listeners like you. This episode is also sponsored by Blueprint 1543. Mental health and trauma are issues many in the church are just waking up to. Christians are wrestling with questions like, what role should my church community play in supporting mental health? How can Christians better care for trauma survivors? How do I know if I need a pastor or a therapist? 1543 is the year often referred to as the start of the scientific revolution, and Blueprint 1543 is a ministry dedicated to using the sciences to accelerate contributions from Christians to life's biggest questions. The folks at Blueprint 1543 want to show how psychology can be approached by church leaders as a relevant tool for loving our neighbor. So right now, you can access a free 8-part audio resource with a downloadable workbook featuring Christian psychology experts engaging with the topic of psychology in the church. For more info, head to psychforministry.com or search Blueprint 1543 wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, back to the show.
Welcome to French Friday on the Holy Post. This week, David French talks about his move to the New York Times and why MAGA conservatives are calling him a sellout when journalism on the far right is where the real big money is found. Then we talk about the 303 creative case at the Supreme Court. Is it really a case about religious liberty versus gay rights? Or is it really a case about free speech? And how do we define what is speech and what is service? The answer to that question will determine whether the government may compel some religious business owners to support same-sex weddings. And new research shows diversity training is largely ineffective. So why do we continue to believe, both inside and outside the church, that pre-packaged programs are the best way to change people's beliefs and behaviors? Here's the latest edition of French Friday.
Guess what day it is?
Oh-ho!
It's French Friday, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Holy Post. I'm here with David French for another French Friday. How are you, David?
I'm doing well.
Okay, well, we're in a new year. I was a little concerned, honestly, when I saw the news about your big professional change, wondering, are we still going to get to do French Fridays? But you're here.
Yes, of course. Why would we not do French Fridays?
Well, because you've made a huge move to the New York Times, which is the first thing we need to talk about. First of all, congratulations.
Well, thanks so much. It's I really came out of the blue, and I'm incredibly grateful, incredibly honored, and I got to confess, I mean, a little apprehensive. I was talking to Charlie Sykes, my friend Charlie Sykes, who does the Bulwark podcast, which is a great podcast, and he said, "Are you nervous about this?" I said, "I think I've been nervous with every job change, a little bit. I was nervous when I left National Review and we started the Dispatch. I mean, it was a startup, right? So that's a little bit nerve-wracking. And then, this is just going to be a really big change. But you're not going to see a change in my writing. I'm going to keep writing about the things that I write about and keep saying the things that I say, I'm really looking forward to it. But it's definitely going to be a big change.
Well, I assume that's part of the reason why the New York Times invited you in the first place, is they like what you're writing. So to dramatically change that would be a problem. And I sympathize a little bit. I have not made professional changes perhaps on the visible scale that you have, but when I have made those, you always have that little bit of imposter syndrome that creeps in, like, am I really okay doing this? Do they know I've not done this before, whatever it might be? But talk a little bit about the reactions that you've seen to your move to the New York Times, because we talked about this a few weeks ago with Phil, and I don't know, as Caitlin or Christian was on the show, we had noticed some of the reactions. How have you seen the reactions?
Oh, yeah, there was a reactions guy. I tweeted out the announcement was going to be made the morning that I left home to drive my son to Santa Cruz, California, to drop him off at UC Santa Cruz. He's transferring there. And so I knew I was going to be offline. So I just tweeted, well-timed. So I just tweeted out the announcement, basically got in the car and left and started driving west. And after several hours, I handed my phone to my wife and I said, could you check on this and see how this is going? And the initial wave was really nice, really positive. Lots of people from across the spectrum, left and right, saying really nice things and being very, congratulatory. And so for a hot minute, I thought, oh, this is going better than I thought it would. I mean, the initial response was just overwhelmingly kind. Checked back in a little while later, and it was like, those horror movies where somebody opens a door and there's like screaming and gruesome scenes behind it, and they just shut it real fast. That's what opening Twitter was like. I think eventually the tweet announcement, that Twitter metric that I sent out got about 3 million views. And the response turned decidedly more negative. First on the right, and mainly on the right, and then secondarily on the left. It got really negative on the left.
So let's take each of
Far
those.
left, yeah.
Let's take each of those in turn. First, why did people on the right or far right flip out? It's the New York Times. It is sort of the standard bearer for what a lot of people consider to be the progressive liberal elite cabal, but they've had conservative writers there for a long time. David Brooks, Ross Douthat, others who, from varying levels of conservatism, have been in their pages for a long, long time, deeply respected. So you're now part of that. Why did people on the right flip out that you would dare to write for the New York Times?
There is this thing on the right where if they don't like you, there's two things that happen if sort of in this MAGA world, in the Trumpist right world. One is they try to write off everything you say critical of the MAGA right as being grifting. This is all, you're doing it for the paychecks, right? That this is what you're doing to get the invites to the cocktail parties, and this is what you're doing to write for the Atlantic, or this is what you're doing to ingratiate yourselves with Morning Joe. Whatever it is, they essentially are treating you as if you don't write what you believe.
Right. You have no convictions. This is all just
no convictions.
Middle school insecurity.
Right. All I am is currying favor with the elite. Right. And so that's part of it. And so part of it is they're saying, oh, look at him. The grifter got the ultimate prize. He's at the New York Times. Look at that. Now, the grifter point is really hilarious, especially in light of the fact that as we're speaking, that the right-wing Twitter is melting down because Steven Crowder, this sort of shock jock comedian podcaster on the right, was offered $50 million by the Daily Wire, and he turned it down as an insulting offer. Okay. I'm not going to.
You're saying the New York Times didn't offer you $50 million?
I mean, 45 million is nice, but it's not 50 million. No, nowhere. Like, not right. Even. I mean, come on. And those of us who are in sort of the business of journalism we know the finances of this world, and we know that the ticket to riches, has not been never Trump. It has not been opposing Trump. It is not. That is, if the ticket to riches were opposing Trump, you would see on the right huge numbers of anti-Trump writers and commentators. No, if you look at it's so transparently obvious that the ticket to real financial wealth in journalism in this era has been Trumpism. I mean, and so the grifter charge is just ridiculous. So one was grifter. And then the other thing is, I think what is important for some folks to understand about the MAGA right is that the whole time that they are railing against cancel culture, they have, many of them, not all of them, but many of them have raised they've raised the practice of cancel culture to an art. So it's not that they just disagree and leave it at a disagreement and shake hands after the debate and that's all. It's, no, they want to destroy your career. They want to destroy your public reputation. It's really a movement that is truly about obliterating its ideological enemies, especially those on the right, so that it can control sort of the narrative on the right entirely. It really is a movement designed to try to destroy people. And when they see somebody that they really hate, that they have tried to destroy, have a professional achievement, it's infuriating. It's infuriating. He's supposed to be, we're supposed to have rendered him irrelevant. We're supposed to have destroyed his career. And so there's this destructive impulse on the right, this impulse that wants to obliterate its opponents. And so this kind of news drives people into a fury.
So what you're experiencing or what you're describing, I've encountered a number of ways indirectly where I'm debating somebody on social media, perhaps on whatever topic, pick from the variety of topics. And if I cite a source, an article, a statistic, and it's from the New York Times, or they've written for the New York Times, or they're in some way associated with the New York Times, the argument back to me is, well, that doesn't count because it's the New York Times. Like there's this immediate dismissal.
Right.
And I saw that happen when you made your announcement. It's like, oh, well, there, we all knew David French was a shill for the left, and now he's just proving what we all knew. So we don't have to pay any attention to him because he's with the New York Times. But on the other side, what you're describing is, well, to be invited to be a columnist for the New York Times is a significant professional achievement. And that does anger them because I'm assuming if it was Ben Shapiro who was invited to write regularly for the New York Times, would they have the same reaction?
A very small group of people would, but as a general rule, no. As a general rule, that would not be the reaction.
Right.
So it really does boil down to, once I started opposing Trump and this Trumpist turn in the GOP, it wasn't that, well, I just disagree with David, but wish him well as a person.
Yeah.
It turned into David must be destroyed.
So without spending too much more time on this, let's talk a little bit about the reaction on the left. What did you hear from that side of the spectrum?
Again, it was a very much the same pattern. On the right, it was initially a bunch of people saying congratulations, and then the attacks came. Very much on the left, there were a lot of folks on the center left who said, oh, great hire. I don't agree with David all the time, but I appreciate reading him and appreciate many of his points, and was really kind, much like that. And then some folks started saying that I was homophobic or transphobic, and it really sort of centered around the trans issue, which then actually fed more of the right, because they go, ha ha ha, look, David's friends are already turning on him. And so it was a the left fed another wave from the right. So it's like the right, then the left, then the right again. And so,
Lovely. Aren't you glad you're continuing down this career path?
It's funny because in many ways, I absolutely love what I do.
Yeah.
You're talking about this imposter syndrome. I just wake up and I feel blessed that people actually will pay subscription money to read what I write. That is mind-blowing to me. It's a great privilege. I really like what I'm able to do in my life. It's a tremendous blessing. At the same time, people ask me what the culture of journalism is like. And I said, let me put it like this. To enjoy real civility with colleagues, I go to bar association meetings. Because lawyers who fight each other in court, sometimes knockdown, drag-out fights for years, are more collegial and supportive of each other than journalists often are. And, I would be involved in cases where it was a 4-year case, a 5-year case. One case lasted 7 years that I worked on. And it got intense. There were moments of real frustration. When it was over, we shook hands. If we saw each other in the street, we'd cross the street to say hi and catch up and see how each other's doing. That was what I thought even a contentious profession was like when it was professional, right? When you had decent people and when it was professional. But a lot of this political journalistic world, again, there are a lot of great people in it who are quite professional and collegial, but this impulse to destroy to ruin the public reputation of your opponents, to end their careers, is really, I think it's alien to most people's experience. Like if you're working at a car dealer, you might want your dealership to prosper, but you're not actively trying to end the jobs of the Hyundai dealership across the street, right? You're not trying to deprive them of a livelihood. And this is sort of the way journalism has become. It's really when you get the far right or some of the far left activists going.
Well, at that point, it ceases to be journalism. Doesn't it just become culture war?
It's culture war.
Yeah,
it's not, and which then reaches to the problem of journalism in a lot of those outlets, because it's not journalism any longer.
Right.
Now, you might have some factual information in there. You might have, I read far right and far left outlets routinely because there are things that I will learn, but I often hold it at arm's length because I know that there is a mission of the organization that is more important to the organization than, getting to the truth.
Okay, last question on this. When can we start seeing you as a byline in the New York Times?
So I start January 30th, and I don't know how soon after that my first column will be up, but really soon after that.
Okay.
So it will not be long.
All right, we look forward to seeing it. I want to begin with an article that you wrote this past month for The Dispatch. Mm-hmm. It's titled The Most Important Thing You Read Today. And the subtitle, it's about diversity training and it's not by me, which is great. Like, open this, but don't read everything I'm about to say because I want you to click into something further.
Yeah.
This is great. This was super interesting. You cite a piece by Jesse Singal. Is that how you say his name?
Singal, yes. Uh-huh.
And he's written about research that's uncovered the ineffectiveness of diversity training. Mm-hmm. And this launches you into a wider conversation around what we think really matters and happens. But let's begin with Jesse Singal's piece on diversity training. What did he uncover that was so interesting?
Yeah, what he uncovered is that diversity training doesn't really work. And to the extent that it has an effect on people, it's often negative. There's often a backlash attached to it. And this is something that's been kind of a dirty little secret for a while now, is that that diversity training doesn't really do a lot.
Well, but before we get into it not doing a lot, what do people hope it does? What is the goal of we've probably all been a part of these in some form or another, but what's stated as being the perceived goal or outcome of diversity training?
Well, you've raised the great question. Okay. Because I got pushback from some folks saying, well, it depends on what you're wanting out of it. So if you're wanting something very, very modest out of it, in other words, you say, well, this is something that's sort of a signaling mechanism to just sort of say, we take diversity seriously, or this is a CYA measure for litigation that is saying, look, we have fully trained our employees in anti-harassment concepts and DEI. Well, then if your goals are very, very modest or perhaps superficial, then diversity training can, quote, work.
Right, but covering your rear end in a lawsuit situation, basically.
Covering your rear end, box checking, right. Or maybe something less tangible but still meaningful, where you're saying, look, we have a diverse workforce and we're signaling to our diverse workforce that we take diversity seriously, that there's a signaling mechanism. So if your objectives are super, super modest, and in those circumstances often unmeasurable, then okay, I can get the argument that it works. But if your objectives are diversity training as a means of fundamentally changing attitudes, in other words, changing the way people view issues of race and gender and sexuality and things like that, or if your view is that diversity training is sort of a mechanism for an indispensable mechanism, for example, in, say, increasing diversity, that it is a necessary step for increasing diversity. Again, the evidence for that is really lacking. So it doesn't appear to really change corporate culture. It doesn't appear to really change individual hearts and minds. and it doesn't appear to really be that instrumental in changing the composition of workforces, as a tool in the toolbox of sort of diversifying workforces. And so basically all of the things that you would want in a program that would be truly impactful, it doesn't accomplish. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't exceptions to this rule, that there might be individual trainers or individual trainings that might be better than others. And Single found that if training is voluntary, in other words, participants are really willingly coming into the training, in other words, are predisposed to want to receive the message, it might be more impactful. But this sort of mandatory diversity training world just isn't impactful.
So my interest in this piece, and I think it's your interest as well, is not so much in diversity training itself.
Right.
It's in the assumption we carry widely that
Yes.
we can form people into the views and beliefs that we think are best with a programmatic approach.
Yes.
And we do that in our corporations, in our schools and universities, in our churches and ministries.
Mm-hmm.
We think if we just employ the right content in the right program, people will come out the other side like some kind of spiritually formative, mechanized industrial factory. They'll come out the other end as this person we want them to be. So the article you cite shows, well, that's not exactly what's happening with diversity training in corporate settings. You cite the fear that a lot of Christian parents have about sending their children to secular universities and colleges, that it's going to deprogram them from the faith and make them into these secular robots. The data says that's not true either, that kids who go to these universities with faith actually hold on to faith at higher rates than one might expect. So what's your big takeaway then from this phenomenon that none of these things seem to be as either effective or as dangerous as we make them out to be?
Yeah. So there are multiple pretty important takeaways here. And another one I used was fertility. So we have this huge issue of declining fertility, not just in the US, but worldwide in advanced nations, advanced economies. And everyone says, here's this program that'll work, and this program, and this program.
Japan has tried all kinds of really crazy stuff.
All kinds of stuff. I mean, paying people, bonuses when they have children, to cradle to grave healthcare, to extended leave. I mean, we've so many, and sometimes you might see a marginal bump here or there, but fundamental change doesn't happen. And so there's so many interesting takeaways from this. One is we often fight intensely, and this was sort of how I led this. We often fight really intensely over things that, truth be told, aren't that consequential. And so the diversity training example, a lot of more progressive people hope that it transforms hearts and minds. And a lot of conservatives, especially when you're getting to sort of more critical race theory informed versions of diversity training, fear that it changes hearts and minds when it doesn't fulfill the hopes, nor does it, enact the fears. It's just kind of there. And similarly with college, there's this sort of incredible emphasis, and you see this in conservative Christian spaces, where what do you say to parents who are about to send their kids to college, right? And I get this question all the time, and I've started with a 2-word response: fear not. Fear not. And one of the reasons why they should fear not is it actually turns out that, and it's been the case for generations, that college-educated people are more religious than non-college educated.
Right.
And so it is not this factory of secularization. And conversely, to folks in the sort of the activist part of academia, they really believe that they are engines of fundamental change in the students, and sometimes act accordingly, inflaming culture wars in their own right when they're not. And so it really does, I think in one sense, it is both empowering and disempowering in different ways. So it's disempowering in the sense that, look, guys, there's no 5-point plan, here for revitalizing the church, or it's there's no 5-point plan for racial reconciliation and harmony. It's not that policy doesn't matter at all. It's just that it's not got the weight, the change. It's not the change agent that you think it is. And then what's empowering is what does change us? What does build us, construct us, and mold us? Turns out, the good old-fashioned close friends, family, intimate relationship dynamics still really, really, really matters.
So when I read this piece, I immediately put my ministry hat back on, my pastor hat, because when I was in pastoral ministry, and even years following that when I was at Christianity Today and reporting on a lot of ministries, this mindset is everywhere in the ministry world. Everyone's looking for the off-the-shelf solution to make disciples, or to reach non-believers, or to grow the church, or to transform young people's lives. And everyone's trying to sell that as the prepackaged, here's what you need to do. Thinking back to the late 2010s, early teens, Willow Creek did a big study that they branded and published under the name Reveal. I don't know if you ever encountered this.
No.
But they hired some outside firm, spent a lot of money to first investigate their own congregation. And then they expanded this to 500, and I think ultimately around 5,000 congregations around the U.S. And the simple task was, what has been proven to help people love God and love their neighbor more? Which of our programs, what activities that we're doing as a church are really moving the needle on what they diagnose to be the core of the faith? And what they came back with was really fascinating. Essentially, it boiled down to 4 things.
Okay.
1 was regular engagement with the Bible, reading the Bible regularly. 2 was prayer. 3 was a meaningful relationship with a mentor, a spiritual mother or father in your life. And 4, some outlet of service toward others. Not necessarily in the church, but just a place where you are contributing and serving others. Those 4 things. And Willow put out this video about this research and the jaw-dropping reality of these findings, where they realized everything we're doing is, we build these $80 million buildings and these huge elaborate programs, and yet it's these 4 simple activities. And the executive pastor at the time, Greg Hawkins, had this white board paper, and he like tore off the sheet and said, we're starting with a brand new sheet. We're going to rejigger everything from the ground up around these 4 things. And eventually they did this whole conference on it. They rolled out, I reported on it numerous times at CT. And then after about 2 years, it all just kind of disappeared. Like you didn't hear anything about Reveal for a while. And I went to some of my sources, my back end sources, like, what happened to Reveal? Where'd it go? And what I was told was, well, the problem with Reveal was you can't really sell anything. You can't sell a program. You can't sell, there's no commercial product based on those 4 things. You don't need an $80 million building to do those 4 things.
Yeah.
And so that's where, and then slowly the megachurch movement, others are reverting back to, well, where's the program? Where's the agenda? Where's the thing I can buy and sell, and the conference ticket I can get? And so it was just interesting to me, similar to your article, like, we want to believe that we can control these outcomes a lot more than we can. And it's like this forever, it's like the fountain of youth. Someone's always ready to sell it to you, even though it never works.
Well, and I've written in the past about sort of a basic principle, which is you can have a lot of influence over a small number of people, and very little influence over a large number of people.
Yeah,
and we often, especially in hyper political times, we flip our emphasis. We flip what really motivates us. Now, there are some people who are professionally in politics or commentary, like we are, and it's kind of our business to speak to lots of people. But even for us, where it's our business to speak to large numbers of people, it really should still be our fundamental life focus of the people right around us in arm's length. That should be our fundamental life focus. And going to that message, what's interesting is it is really hard to make that level of friendship and intimacy programmatic.
Right.
And and churches try, the small group phenomenon, which can be really great. And if you're like me, Sky, you've been in some that were really not.
Yeah.
It's very difficult, but the really good small groups I've been a part of have arisen organically, often out of pre-existing friend groups, find sort of extending a little bit and adding mutual friends, and it can be really, really wonderful. But it's that closeness, it's that intimacy that really matters. And this tracks on all kinds of fronts. It's not just church, for example, but when we're looking at the phenomenon of deaths of despair, where we're really trying to find what's the programmatic solution to all these drug addictions, to all this drug addiction, to the suicide, to the alcoholism. What's programmatic? What can we do? Well, you can distribute Narcan widely, and that can help, but it doesn't heal the heart. And what you're finding is, if when you break down and you see who is it that is killing themselves, who is it that is dying of drug overdoses, again and again it comes back to, while all demographics are effective, single men are affected more than any other demographic, both never been married and married and divorced. And it's that lack of intimacy, it's that lack of relationship that is just so crippling.
And that's also what's so terrifying about trying to correct it. Because, like you said, whether it's a church or a societal example, we may be able to create settings or environments where those kinds of relationships may transpire, where they could coalesce, but you can't guarantee it. You can't make it happen. And as we see our society become more and more atomized, and young people especially who are not equipped for basic social interaction because of the influence of social media and devices on these young minds, they're not equipped to do the very thing that's necessary for human flourishing and mental health. Yeah. And then we look for a national solution, a programmatic solution, a political solution, a school solution, and none of them are adequate to really tackle what we're trying to do. And I'm not advocating that we don't do anything. Yeah. But my father's a physician, and he's talked to me all my life about the fact I remember when I was in middle school or high school, one time he came home from work and he's just like, I have to get out of this country. And he left for a week or two to go overseas to do some kind of medical missions work thing. He's not even a Christian, but he did it anyway. And when he got back, I asked him why. And he said, I'm so tired of dealing with patients where all their health problems are self-induced lifestyle issues. And I wanted to go overseas where I'm helping people who are sick or diseased for no fault of their own. It's not because they ate too much or drank too much or smoked too much, but because, just natural diseases. And it's a little bit like that when you've spent your whole life in an environment where everything around you is malformative. It's really hard to then put a program in place that's going to change that. And that seems like what we're often trying to do, whether it's on the issues of race or personal health or relational dynamics. We're looking for a government or cultural solution to things, which the ship may have already sailed.
Well, and then if it comes through politics often, if it codes to the right or codes to the left, it's immediately alienating to millions of people that you're wanting to reach or wanting to help. And, the more I look into, and let's just peel back from sort of race and racial reconciliation and move to the masculinity issue and masculinity crisis, where we have this really sad situation in America where there's a bifurcation in outcomes of young men and boys. And that is, it's sort of at the top of American society, boys do really well. They're still disproportionately in corporate boardrooms. They're disproportionately political leaders. They're disproportionately at sort of this apex of society. But once you move past the elite ranks, boys are really struggling.
Yeah, fewer boys in college now than girls, I believe.
By a long shot.
Yeah.
And really having trouble with educational attainment, really having trouble with mental health. And when you drill down into it, what you see for an awful lot of folks is that boys are really impacted by loss of fathers. Really impacted by that. They're also young men are really impacted, and men are really impacted by loss of friendships. And as we've seen, they're really impacted by loss of relationships with women. And so what's the government program to make you a father, friend, or husband? What's that government program that makes you a good father, a good friend, or a good husband? And that's where, and it's really fascinating. There's a study a couple years ago that showed that boys do better in neighborhoods where there are more fathers, even if boys don't have a father.
Yeah.
Because of that mentoring,
right?
And that exposure. And so if your emphasis, if a big part of the masculinity crisis is just too few guys are fathers or husbands or friends or have friends, what's your 5-point plan for that?
Right.
And then if you try to filter the masculinity crisis through, well, to really deal with the masculinity crisis, we have to destroy the left. Well, that ain't it. That's not what's going to do it.
It reminds me, back in the Obama administration, I was invited to the White House for a series of meetings with a bunch of other faith leaders from all different traditions, because President Obama had an initiative around fatherhood. And having grown up without his father and recognizing especially the impact that fatherlessness was having on African-American communities, he wanted to tackle this. But in all those meetings, the administration representatives were, I think, pretty honest. And they went through all of the costs of fatherlessness on society. And most of those costs end up in the government's sector, right? With higher rates of addiction, dropouts from school, imprisonment, violent crime for young men, all this kind of stuff ends up costing taxpayers more money. And yet the administration was honest in saying, we cannot create programs to fix this, which is why we've invited you all here, faith leaders, because we need churches and synagogues and religious groups and clubs engaging in these communities and creating mentoring relationships, because at the end of the day, if you do that, it's going to be better for everyone. And that was coming from the Obama administration, which is, everyone sees as a more progressive liberal thing, but they also recognize the limits of what government action can do. The other thing that comes to mind is years ago, there was a professor that we interviewed. I forget where he was at, but he had spent decades interviewing. It was a Christian university where he taught, and he had spent decades asking college freshmen to write a brief testimony about their faith and what was most influential. And he collected these things for 30 some years, and he looked for common themes throughout these stories. And what he concluded was that for these young people, I think men and women, what he concluded was the most important people in their life that shaped their views and faith by the time they were in their 20s was not their parents, but what he described as a peer of their parents. So a coach or a teacher or a pastor or somebody of their parents' generation who nonetheless was mentoring or befriending that young person. Because we all know by the time your kids are teenagers or young adults, mom and dad are idiots. They don't know what they're talking about. But a peer of the parent has a deep, deep influence. And so to create environments where those kinds of relationships are more likely to occur is really important for the formation of young people. So even not having a father at home, like you said, those environments where young people are encountering other older men who can function in a fatherly way makes a huge, huge difference.
And the people who are really smart in this space, they know everything that you just said. They know how important a coach can be, right? They know how important a friend's dad can be, even if you and your dad are somewhat estranged or whatever. They know all of this. They know how important good peer relationships are. But how do you, and you'll hear this in philanthropy a lot, this phrase, scalability.
Right.
You know, if you know a really good coach is really important, well, you can't pass, here's our 5-year, $50 billion good coach package that we're going to, and that, you know, that kind of scalability of intimacy, it's a contradiction in terms, right? This sort of idea that, well, from the top down, you can scale up these close, positive, close personal relationships. Now, you can do things that, where you can do things that make it easier to have good schools or to have good schooling environments. You can do things to sort of make it to where government isn't an impediment and can maybe nudge here and there in some positive ways. Again, no one's saying policy doesn't matter at all. It's just rarely does it get at the heart of the matter of these really profound issues of the heart and mind.
Okay, last question on this before we move on. What are the implications of this then for the culture wars? Because it feels like so much of our culture warring is built on the assumption that if we can just get control of X, this institution or this policy or this narrative in the culture, it will shape hearts and minds in the direction that we want it to go. That's the argument from both the left and the right. Does this just undermine culture war entirely as not just harmful, but irrelevant?
I would say it undermines culture war, not to say that it's completely irrelevant, because religious liberty matters, for example, but it is not nearly as relevant and material to our lives as we tend to believe. And so what ends up happening is you kind of have this continual Lucy with the football phenomenon, where 20, 25 years ago, I'm in rooms where Christian leaders are saying, if we can achieve A, B, C, and D in religious liberty doctrine, we'll be golden.
Yeah.
And guess what? We didn't just achieve A, B, C, and D. We achieved A, B, C, D, a bonus C, and a bonus F. and church attendance keeps declining. There is, every generation from boomers down is less church attending than the generation before it. And so then now, religious liberty didn't do it. Well, it's got to be, we got to have more power. Now we got to really shape the culture. This is the rise of Christian nationalism, right? Well, we need to make government more Christian, and that'll do it. Whereas 15 years ago, the conviction was, if you just get government out of our way and give us the full liberty to evangelize, that'll do it. And so there's always sort of this new thing that is the thing that will reverse cultural decline, transform hearts and minds, when it's all so much more complicated than that.
Everyone's looking for the silver bullet, and everyone's trying to sell the silver bullet.
Right.
Okay, let's shift, as Monty Python would say, now for something completely different. I want to pick up something that I was hoping to talk to you about in December, but we never got around to because we didn't have time. And that's the Supreme Court case 303 Creative. And people are going to have to go back in their archives a little bit to remember what this is about, although we're still waiting for the ruling. So we're in between the arguments and the ruling. I don't know when that will come out. But 303 Creative made a lot of headlines because the articles I saw, with the exception of what you wrote, tended to frame it as a Supreme Court case that was pitting religious liberty against gay rights.
Right.
And let's start with just the facts of the case. This is a case about a website designer who creates websites for, I think, a variety of purposes, including weddings.
Including weddings, yes.
And they were being sued. Was it preemptively?
No, they sued preemptively.
They sued preemptively.
Yes.
To be allowed to deny their creative services for same-sex weddings.
Right.
So unlike the famous Colorado baker, nobody came to this website designer and said, we would like you to make a website for our same-sex wedding.
Right.
And then was denied service. They did it, which is a whole nother aspect of this case, which I don't quite understand. But let's begin with this. Why is this not a case of religious liberty versus gay rights?
Well, so there's a couple of answers to this. One is the reality is that 303 Creative will serve gay customers. So this is not a situation like you saw in the Jim Crow South, where people who had a sandwich shop or a barbecue shop or a barbecue restaurant would say, nope, we are not serving black customers. This is more like, imagine you had a portrait artist and the Grand Wizard, like, let's just take an extreme example. Okay, this is not this case, but extreme example just to help people understand what we're talking about. You are a portrait artist and you sell your artistic abilities that's how you make money. You're not a church, you're not a nonprofit, you're a for-profit portrait artist. And the Grand Wizard of the Klan walks in and says, I want a heroic portrait of myself draped in the Confederate flag. And you say, no, I'm just not going to do that. That's not what I'm going to use my artistic ability, and painting is an absolute form of expression. And even though I sell my expression in the public square, that doesn't mean that I have to express anything you ask me to express.
Right.
Maybe I don't paint nudes, for example. And so everyone gets that. They're like, yeah.
It's compelled speech. You can't compel speech, right?
Or if you're a lawyer and you're offering your services to the public, and let's say you're the best lawyer in town and you're quite progressive, and a Christian group comes in and says, I want you to represent me because we have a for-profit wedding venue and we don't want to offer it for same-sex weddings. And you're a progressive lawyer and you disagree with that position, disagree with the Christian position, the Christians can't then sue you and say it's religious discrimination for you not to represent us on a cause that you don't like. So those are, when you use those kinds of analogies, most people are like, oh, I get it. We're talking about compelled speech. Now, with the 303 Creative, just like with Masterpiece Cake Shop, and just like with the case called Arlene's Flowers before, that happened before 303 Creative, the issue is really boils down to, is this compelled speech?
Right.
Or is it refusing a service?
Exactly. When I was engaging with friends on Twitter and combatants on Twitter, that was what it came down to, is if you believe it's speech, it should not be compelled. But if you believe it's a service, then public accommodation law applies.
Right, exactly. And so one of the reasons why Masterpiece Cake Shop was decided on very narrow grounds, this was the case involving a custom bakery where a baker, Jack Phillips, refused to design a custom cake for a same-sex wedding, but would sell a cake that was off the shelf.
Right.
And because his argument was, when I custom design, I'm using independent artistic expression. When you're buying something that I just made for anybody, then that's more of a service and versus individual expression. And if you go back and you read the oral argument in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, a big part of it is, wait a minute, is this really art? Or is this more like somebody serving a well-cooked steak, right?
Right.
There's artistry involved in food prep, but is it art? Like painting a portrait? Is it? And so the case was ultimately decided on very, very narrow grounds.
They basically avoided answering the question, is this art or speech?
Avoided it.
Right.
303 Creative, you can't avoid it. I mean, for one thing, the lower court said, yeah, this is speech, and the state can compel it anyway. And
which is really weird.
Really weird. And you can tell how weird that decision was because in the oral argument of 303 Creative, that's the state of Colorado did not really defend that 10th Circuit decision. They didn't wrap their arms around it at all. And the argument actually ended up being a lot like the Masterpiece Cake Shop argument, where the justices were really working through whether this was an independent artistic expression or just a basic website template. And if it was just some sort of basic website template, well, then isn't that more like denying a service? And that's where the argument came down.
Okay, so a couple different pieces here. I'm going back and thinking through some of the conversations I had online about this. Among Christians, first of all, what do you make of the fact that the 303 Creative folks preemptively filed this suit? That it wasn't like the cake baker where a gay couple came in and requested a custom cake. Does that impact the outcome of this at all, or is it irrelevant?
Not really relevant. That's a very common way of dealing with. So in the First Amendment context, if a law exists on the books that or either on its face or by well-known interpretation will infringe upon your free speech rights, you have standing to sue to reverse that law because of the chilling effect that the existence of the law has on constitutionally protected expression. I sued a bunch of universities in my career. Most of the time, they had taken concrete action to violate my client's rights. Some of the time, I sued when students were living under speech codes, and they didn't violate the speech code out of fear that they would be punished. So we challenged the speech code to remove the chilling effect. And so that's a very common way. People do it on the right side of the spectrum. People do it on the left side of the spectrum. It's a very common way of vindicating constitutional rights.
Okay, the other thing that came up quite a bit, particularly from Christians on my Twitter exchanges, was, and this regards both the website designer idea as well as the cake baker or the flower arranger, pick your service or creative endeavor. A number of people just simply said, well, that's just unchristian. They should do it as a way of loving their neighbor, even if they disagree, and to file these kinds of lawsuits or to challenge these kinds of things. It's just unchristian. It's wrong, and we should love our neighbors in a pluralistic society, including those who may have views on marriage or sexuality that don't conform to our religious beliefs.
Right.
So we should let it go. I have a response to that, but I'm curious what your response to that is.
My response is there's a big difference between should or must. So, we confuse this. Guy, you and I have talked about this a ton. The argument about is action A, B, or C moral or immoral is a different argument from should action A, B, or C be legal or illegal.
Right.
And when you're a civil libertarian like I am, what you find is that one of the great enemy of liberty is the equating of morality and legality. And so First Amendment attorneys like I've been, you represent people you disagree with all the time, because you know that there's an underlying freedom where, look, the fact that someone can do something doesn't mean that the fact that they can doesn't mean that it's right. But the question is, do we want to use the power of the state to enforce my particular moral view in the way that somebody speaks? And this is I keep going back to this, and I've had the same argument, and I said, okay, what we're talking about are two different arguments. The argument of whether she should or should not design the website is a valid argument to have, and there are absolutely valid, and there are positions I respect on both sides of that argument. But that's not this case. This case is, should the power of the state be used to compel speech? And I bring it back to the 1943 case of West Virginia v. Barnett, one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history. And it's two Jehovah's Witness sisters at the height of World War II refused to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, should they have said it? I mean, I would say, yeah, I would say the Pledge of Allegiance. I've said it countless times. I have no problem saying it. Should we use the power of the state to expel them if they don't? No. No. We should protect rights of conscience. We should protect individual liberty, especially in circumstances where you're compelling speech. And this is a famous quote, that if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, no official, high or petty, can prescribe what is orthodox in law, politics, nationalism, religion. And so it's fundamental to our liberty that we are not compelled to say things that we find disagreeable. And so there's a must and a should dichotomy there, and we sometimes confuse those things.
Absolutely. I saw that happening over and over and over again in the conversations I was a part of.
Yeah.
And my best way of responding to that was, if I were a pastor to Jack Phillips, or if I was the pastor or spiritual advisor to the person running 303 Creative, I would advise them to bake the cake or make the website and not have it violate your conscience before God. There's nothing wrong with it. But there's a difference between that and saying the government is coming in and saying you have to do this. It's government compelled speech, because that opens up a terrible can of worms that leads to a lot of bad things. So if you can predict where you think this case is going based on what you heard in the oral arguments and all the amicus briefs that were put forward, how do you think this comes out in this court? I mean, the court definitely leans more conservative than it did a few years ago, but is that a factor here, or is this a slam dunk one way or the other?
So it is a factor. I don't think it's a factor necessarily in does 303 Creative win. So Jack Phillips won with a different court 7-2 because the court found, and Justice Kagan and Justice Breyer from the Democratic-nominated wing of the court joined the Republican-nominated majority, finding there was explicit religious discrimination against Jack Phillips. You don't have that kind of fact pattern here. My guess is you're going to have the question is it going to be a more maximal ruling, in which case you're going to have you'll probably have 5-4 or 6-3 in 303 Creative's favor, or is it going to be, again, a more narrow ruling where you might then go 7-2, 8-1, something like that? I would be really, really surprised if 303 Creative lost. Really surprised, in large part because this is just a fundamental, a very different case from Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Cake Shop, because you're putting up a website. The website's got words. It's got artistic design. It's got the argument that its expression is so much stronger than saying this cake has flowers on it, which, there you had all kinds of arguments around Masterpiece Cake Shop. Like, wait a minute, an architect is engaging in artistry, and they might drew a staircase that's particularly beautiful. So does that mean that an architect can refuse to design houses for a gay couple? That
right.
kind of...
Well, and that raises the bigger question for me in this whole case is, do the courts have to really clearly differentiate what is speech and what is service? Or are they just going to avoid getting into that at all? Because if something is a public service, accommodation laws apply. I'm serving you a hamburger. I can't discriminate against you based on your identity. Whereas if it's speech, well, it's a custom burger and I've, artistically created it with these special garnishes or whatever, then suddenly speech is the government cannot compel you to create speech. So is that really the problem that we're going to keep bumping up against in case after case after case, is we don't have a clear line between service and speech?
I think it is going to be very hard to draw a clear line. So I'm not quite sure how much they're even going to try. So sometimes what they do is they'll say, this is speech. Okay, this is speech. Designing a website is speech, period. Next case. And so then what lower courts have to do is work out for themselves how close is this particular case to the 303 Creative versus other cases. But the one thing that I would say is, I don't think you'll see a whole lot of cases after this. I could be wrong. Somebody might replay this clip and say, look at that idiot. But how I can count on the fingers of one hand the prominent cases along these lines in the last 10 years. There's just not many. In large part because there's, quite frankly, the vast majority of people, they serve gay weddings. Right? They perform services or create art or whatever for gay weddings. And in the vast majority of cases, so for example, if you're two men are getting married and you say, well, who should design my website? They might call one of their friends who had just gotten married, and they say, well, we'll use this. And it is very rare. These cases are very rare because the conflict between customer and artist is not common. This just doesn't happen very much. And it will happen, I think, even less once this case is decided. Again, depending on the language, if the court goes ahead and sort of reaffirms that the provision of a service is different from the expression of art, from artistic expression, then again, you're going to have, that will narrow it down even more. But I think it is very difficult to draw a bright line, 2-sentence legal standard that says this is expression and this is a hamburger. You can say a hamburger isn't expression and designing a website is, but you're always going to have those kind of mushy cases where it gets hard, like a floral arrangement. To me, that's a hard one.
Okay, last question. Assuming the case comes out the way you think in favor of 303 Creative, are there implications for this beyond the gay wedding environment? Like, I mean, we keep hearing these cases about wedding cakes and floral arrangements and photographers, things like that. But are there any broader legal implications of a case like this outside of that narrow world of same-sex ceremonies?
Really, yes, but I would say yes in this sense. If the case comes out the way I think it does, it's going to be a reaffirmation of a lot of existing free speech jurisprudence. And so that, from that standpoint, it's not going to be that consequential, because it's just sort of saying all that stuff we've been saying for 50 years, we're still saying it, or 80 years, or because it's 80 now since Barnett. So all that stuff we've been saying, we still mean it. So ruling for 303 Creative is kind of a status quo type ruling. From a First Amendment standpoint. Ruling against 303 Creative, I'm not saying it's the end of the world, but you're removing a brick out of the wall of protection for free expression. And so does that mean other bricks would be removed? Don't know. But the change would be if 303 Creative loses the case, which I don't think they'll be. And they'll lose. And everyone needs to remember that when the case comes out, because you're going to see a lot of apocalyptic rhetoric.
That's what I'm anticipating.
You're going to see people comparing this to like people turning away black customers from restaurants, and it's not that at all. This is about compelled speech. And if they rule for 303 Creative, you're really talking about preserving the status quo.
Well, this is one of the reasons I enjoyed talking to you about these cases, or listening to Advisory Opinions, your podcast with Sarah Isgur, because so much of the popular journalism on cases like this is so inaccurate, or at least the framing of the stories leads the reader in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And understanding the real legal implications of these cases, or the basis on which they're argued on both sides that agree, like, it makes a huge difference. And that's what I was encountering in a lot of my engagement, is people in good faith were reading what was out there, but were not being aided by the journalism that they were engaging, because it was framing it as religious liberty versus gay rights,
exactly,
rather than compelled speech or free speech. So thank you for framing that for us.
Well, and also, this is a total normal human way of responding to cases. Is you'll kind of hear the fact pattern, and you forget the must-should distinction, right? And you start to think, well, who do I like in this story? You know, who do I identify with more? Who do I want to see win? And when it comes to the law, that's not the frame with which you view the law,
which is why Lady Justice wears a blindfold.
Exactly. And that's why, for example, criminal defense lawyers are indispensable to the operation of justice in the United States, because as soon as you hear accusations, for example, against criminal defendants, 99 out of 100 of us, our mind locks in and says, they need to be punished.
Right.
And there's that 1 out of 100, the criminal defense lawyer goes, maybe the charge is wrong. Or maybe the government overstepped in its attempt to prove these charges. And so that must-should distinction always should be really in top of mind whenever you're thinking through legal questions.
Well, David, thank you for being back with us. We really look forward to seeing what you're going to be writing for the New York Times, and all the fury it will cause on both the extreme right and left, which will be painful for you and entertaining for the rest of us.
I'm so glad I can be of service.
That's why you're here, right? No, truly, grateful for your wisdom and clarity and your sanity in the midst of some really difficult things, and grateful that you continue to share that on the Holy Post.
Well, thanks so much, Sky, for having me, and it's always a joy to join you.
French Friday is a production of Holy Post Media, featuring David French and me, Sky Jatani. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This show is made possible by Holy Post patrons. To find out how you can become a Holy Post patron and to find more common good Christian content, go to holypost.com.